The call that changed everything. Officer Michael Rodriguez had experienced his fair share of tough calls in his decade-long career. From late-night domestic disturbances to high-stakes chases through city streets, he'd handled it all. But nothing could have prepared him for what he would face that fateful day in July. The afternoon sun bore down on his patrol car as he navigated the familiar streets of the quiet suburban neighborhood. His partner, Robin, sat in the passenger seat, sipping from her water bottle and chatting idly about her weekend plans. Michael nodded along, his mind partially engaged, but mostly focused on the road ahead. Just as he began to relax, the radio crackled with a sudden urgency. "All units, we have a 911 call from a young boy." Caller requested immediate assistance. Then the line went dead. Location is approximately 1542 Elm Street. Michael's stomach twisted. Elm Street was a rundown area, a part of town known for its economic struggles and occasional criminal activity. It was the kind of place where children playing outside unsupervised was a normal occurrence, but emergency calls from young kids weren't common. Instinctively, he flipped on the sirens, his heart rate accelerating as he pressed the gas pedal down. Robin adjusted her seatbelt, her expression growing serious. "That's only a few minutes away. Let's hope it's just a misunderstanding." Michael nodded, though he felt a weight settle in his chest. "Dispatch, Unit 234 responding. ETA 2 minutes." As they approached the address, the houses became increasingly dilapidated. Many of them had boarded-up windows, overgrown yards, and abandoned cars out front. It was clear that this part of town had seen better days. Michael's grip tightened on the steering wheel as they finally pulled up to the house at 1542 Elm Street, a small, shabby structure with peeling paint and broken steps leading up to the front door. "Stay alert," he told Robin, glancing over at her. She gave a curt nod, her hand instinctively moving to her holster. "Got it." Michael stepped out of the patrol car, the weight of his duty pressing heavily on his shoulders. As they made their way to the front door, he noticed a tricycle lying abandoned in the front yard. Its wheels rusted and bent. A small, faded teddy bear sat propped against the front step, its glassy eyes staring out into the street. He felt a pang in his chest, wondering who had once played with these toys. Robin rapped her knuckles on the door, calling out, "Police. Anyone home?" Silence. Michael tried the door, but it was locked. He glanced back at Robin, who nodded. "Let's check around back." They circled the house, pushing through a tangle of overgrown weeds and broken debris. As they reached the backyard, they noticed a small window slightly ajar. Michael knelt down, peering inside. The room was dark, but he could make out what looked like a living room in utter disarray. Broken furniture, trash, and torn papers scattered across the floor. Something wasn't right. "Robin," he whispered, "this place looks like a war zone. Be ready for anything." They circled back to the front, and after a brief moment of hesitation, Michael kicked the door open, the sound echoing through the empty neighborhood. The stench that greeted them was overpowering, a foul mix of decay, urine, and something sour that made Michael's stomach turn. Inside, the house was a wreck. Dirty dishes piled in the sink, garbage bags split open on the floor, and mold-covered walls hinted at months, maybe years, of neglect. Michael's heart sank as he scanned the room, his mind racing through the possibilities. Who could let a child live here? Robin murmured, her voice thick with disgust. Just then, a faint noise reached Michael's ears, a muffled, weak cry coming from upstairs. He froze, adrenaline spiking in his veins. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. Robin nodded, her eyes wide. Together, they climbed the creaking staircase, each step feeling heavier than the last. The cries grew louder as they approached a closed door at the end of the hallway. Michael's heart pounded in his chest as he reached for the doorknob, but it was locked. He motioned for Robin to stand back before slamming his shoulder into the door. It took 3 tries, but finally, the door gave way, splintering as it swung open. The sight that greeted them was something out of a nightmare. Huddled in the corner of a small, dimly lit room was a boy, no older than 7 or 8. His clothes were torn and filthy, his hair matted and unkempt. His eyes were wide with fear as he looked up at them, clutching his knees to his chest. But what struck Michael the most was the familiarity of the boy's face, the shape of his nose, the curve of his chin, the unmistakable blue eyes he had seen every day in the mirror. "Dad?" the boy whispered, his voice trembling. Michael felt his legs go weak, barely able to comprehend the reality before him. The boy, the one he had come to rescue, was his own son, Nate. For a moment, everything else faded away. The sounds of the house, Robin's concerned questions, the distant hum of sirens, all of it was drowned out by the pounding of his heart as he stared at his son, disbelief and horror mingling in his gaze. "Nate," he choked out, his voice barely above a whisper. The boy nodded, tears streaming down his dirt-streaked cheeks. "Dad, help me." Michael dropped to his knees, reaching out to touch his son's shoulder, to confirm that he was real, that this wasn't some horrible dream. His hands shook as he pulled Nate into an embrace, feeling the fragile bones of his son's small frame beneath his fingertips. Robin stepped back, giving them a moment, her own eyes wide with shock, as she realized the gravity of the situation. How did this happen?" Michael asked, his voice breaking. Nate buried his face in his father's shoulder, his small body racked with silent sobs. Michael held him close, his mind racing with questions, each one more painful than the last. He had lost custody of Nate 2 years prior in a messy divorce, and his ex-wife had moved to another state, taking Nate with her. He had tried to stay in touch, to visit whenever he could, but his relationship with his ex-wife had been strained, and communication was minimal. He had never imagined, not in his worst nightmares, that his son would end up here, in this place, in these conditions. "Who did this to you?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Nate looked up, his blue eyes filled with a mixture of fear and relief. "Mom, she left me here," he stammered. "She said she'd be back, but she never came." Michael's heart shattered. He held Nate close, anger and sorrow boiling within him as he realized the extent of the neglect his son had endured. This was more than abandonment. It was a betrayal of the deepest kind. As the paramedics arrived, Michael reluctantly let go, allowing them to examine Nate. He stood back, his fists clenched, helplessness and fury swirling within him. Robin placed a hand on his shoulder, her face pale with shock and empathy. "We'll get to the bottom of this," she murmured. "We'll make sure he's safe." Michael nodded, unable to speak. All he could do was watch as his son was lifted onto a stretcher, his small hand reaching out for him one last time before he was taken away. This was just the beginning. He was determined to bring those responsible to justice and to ensure that Nate would never have to suffer like this again. A father's quest for justice. After the whirlwind of paramedics and flashing lights, Michael sat alone in his police cruiser, hands clenching the steering wheel as the weight of what he had just witnessed settled over him. The events of the last hour played on a loop in his mind. His son, Nate, frail and terrified, lying on that filthy floor, chained and abandoned. The reality of it all had yet to fully sink in. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw his son's face, pale and hollow, staring up at him with a mixture of fear and relief. Michael's thoughts drifted to his ex-wife, Sarah. How could she have done this? What had led her to abandon their son in such horrific conditions? His mind raced with questions, each one twisting the knife of betrayal deeper. He knew things between them had been bad, but this was beyond comprehension. There had to be more to the story, something he was missing, something that could explain this unimaginable act. As he started the car, Michael's radio crackled with life, breaking his reverie. Robin's voice came through, soft and understanding. "Michael, you don't have to go back out. You should take some time. The chief will understand. He took a deep breath, steadying himself before he responded. "Thanks, Robin. I appreciate it. But I can't rest. Not yet. I need to find out what happened. I need to know why she did this." He didn't mention the anger boiling beneath the surface, the rage that had simmered ever since he'd realized that his son was the victim in this nightmare. Robin sighed on the other end of the line. "I understand. But take care of yourself, okay? If you need backup, just call." Michael didn't answer. He ended the call and drove off, the wheels of his cruiser grinding against the rough road. His destination was clear in his mind. His ex-wife's last known address, a small apartment in a rundown complex on the other side of town. It had been months since he'd seen her, longer still since they'd spoken. Their marriage had disintegrated 2 years ago, torn apart by arguments, misunderstandings, and ultimately, her spiraling behavior. When the courts had awarded her primary custody, he'd fought it. He'd argued that she was unstable, but his long hours and unpredictable shifts had weakened his case. But this was proof that he had been right. If only the judge had listened, if only he had fought harder, maybe none of this would have happened. The apartment complex loomed before him, each building identical in its wear and neglect. Faded paint, cracked sidewalks, and broken windows. An eerie echo of the house he'd found Nate in. Michael took a steadying breath and approached the entrance. He found her apartment number and rapped on the door, the sound echoing down the silent hallway. No answer. He knocked again, harder this time. "Sarah, it's Michael. Open up." Silence. After a long moment, he heard movement inside. The door creaked open a crack, revealing a woman with disheveled hair and hollow eyes. She looked older than he remembered, her once vibrant face now shadowed with exhaustion. Her expression shifted from surprise to irritation as she took in his presence. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice laced with annoyance. "What do I want?" he replied, struggling to keep his voice steady. "I want to know why I found our son chained in a filthy house, alone and terrified. I want to know what could possibly have led you to abandon him like that." For a moment, something flickered in her eyes. A flash of guilt, maybe even regret. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared. She straightened, crossing her arms defensively. "You don't understand, Michael. You don't know what it's been like for me, trying to raise him on my own. You weren't there. You don't get it." "Don't give me that," he snapped, his frustration boiling over. "I wanted to be there. I fought for him. But you made it impossible, and now you've done this. Do you have any idea what you've put him through? Do you even care?" She looked away, biting her lip. I had no choice. Things got out of control. I couldn't handle it. And I thought someone would find him sooner." The casualness of her words made Michael's stomach churn. "You thought someone would find him. You left our child in a decaying house and walked away, expecting someone else to step in and save him. That's beyond irresponsible, Sarah. That's cruel." She met his gaze, her expression hardening. "Don't you dare judge me, Michael. You have no idea what it's like to feel trapped, to have no one to turn to. I was drowning." Michael took a step back, swallowing the urge to lash out. He could feel the weight of her words, but it didn't justify her actions. "If you were struggling, why didn't you ask for help? Why didn't you call me?" She laughed bitterly. "You? The cop who couldn't even keep his marriage together. What were you going to do, swoop in and save us? I didn't need you then, and I don't need you now." Her words stung, but Michael refused to let her deflection distract him. He took a steadying breath, forcing himself to remain calm. "I don't care about your reasons, Sarah. All I care about is Nate. He's in the hospital now, and he's safe, but you're going to answer for what you did. You don't get to just walk away from this." She paled, her bravado faltering. "The hospital," she whispered, as though the reality of her actions had finally hit her. Is he okay?" "He's alive," Michael replied coldly. "But he's traumatized. He was chained to a radiator, starving, in filth. That's what you left him in. Do you really think he'll ever forget that?" She pressed her hand to her mouth, her eyes wide with something that looked like horror. "I didn't mean. I didn't think." Michael shook his head. "Save it. I'm filing a report, and you'll answer for this. Nate deserves better." He turned and left, feeling her gaze on his back as he walked down the hallway. Part of him felt a sick satisfaction at her fear, at the knowledge that she would face consequences. But another part of him felt hollow, the weight of sorrow and guilt pressing down on him. He couldn't shake the image of Nate's fragile frame, his haunted eyes. Outside, he took a deep breath, trying to clear his head. He called Robin, asking her to meet him at the hospital. He needed her support, someone who understood the pain he was carrying, and he knew he couldn't face Nate alone. Not yet. At the hospital, Robin was waiting for him near the entrance. She gave him a sympathetic look as he approached, her eyes full of concern. "How did it go?" Michael shook his head, running a hand over his face. She's lost, Robin. I don't even recognize her anymore. And the worst part is, she doesn't seem to understand what she's done. She's trying to justify it, saying she had no choice." Robin sighed, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Some people can't see past their own struggles. It doesn't excuse what she did, but it's clear she's not in a good place either." He nodded, though it didn't make him feel any better. "I just want to make sure Nate never has to go through anything like that again. I'm going to fight for full custody this time. I won't let her have any hold over him." Robin nodded, her face solemn. "And I'll support you, whatever you need." Together, they walked into the hospital, where Nate was resting in a small room on the pediatric floor. The sight of his son lying in the hospital bed, hooked up to monitors, broke Michael's heart all over again. He approached slowly, his steps soft as he entered the room. Nate's eyes fluttered open, and he smiled weakly when he saw his father. "Dad." Michael sat by his side, taking his small hand in his. "Hey, buddy, how are you feeling?" Nate shrugged, his voice soft. "Better, I think. The doctors are nice." Michael felt a pang of relief, though it was tinged with sadness. He'd failed to protect his son, but now he would do everything in his power to make up for it. "I'm so sorry, Nate. I should have been there for you sooner," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. Nate squeezed his hand, his blue eyes shining with resilience. "It's okay, Dad. You're here now." And in that moment, Michael knew that he had to be strong, not just for himself, but for his son. Healing begins. Over the next few days, Michael stayed by Nate's side in the hospital, refusing to leave. He couldn't bear the thought of his son waking up alone, especially after everything he'd been through. Each time Nate woke from sleep, Michael was there, ready to offer a comforting hand and a gentle smile. He watched over him as he rested, as the color slowly returned to his cheeks, and as the faintest glimmers of his lively spirit began to show again. The doctors had been cautiously optimistic. Nate was malnourished and dehydrated, but his young body was resilient, bouncing back faster than they'd initially expected. Physically, he would heal in time, but the emotional scars ran deeper, and Michael knew those would take far longer to mend. One afternoon, as Michael sat by Nate's bed, he noticed his son fidgeting with a frayed edge of his hospital blanket, his small fingers pulling at the threads. Nate hadn't talked much about what happened, and Michael hadn't pushed him. He knew the time would come when Nate was ready, but it was still difficult to sit in silence, waiting for his son to process it all. Finally, Nate looked up, his blue eyes clouded with confusion and a hint of fear. "Dad," he said softly, his voice barely more than a whisper, "why did Mom leave me there?" Michael felt his heart break all over again. He searched for words, but none seemed adequate. How could he explain something he didn't fully understand himself? He took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "Nate, sometimes grown-ups make mistakes, big mistakes, and sometimes they get so caught up in their own problems that they They forget what's really important, he said, his voice trembling slightly. But what happened to you should never have happened. And I promise I'll never let it happen again. I'm here for you always. Nate stared at him, his young face etched with an expression far too old for his age. Was it because I did something wrong? The question struck Michael like a physical blow. He shook his head fiercely, leaning closer to his son. No, Nate. You didn't do anything wrong. None of this is your fault. Do you hear me? You are perfect just the way you are. And none of this was because of you. It was because of the choices other people made. Nate nodded slowly, though Michael could see the doubt lingering in his eyes. He reached out and gently stroked Nate's hair, trying to soothe him as best he could. Sometimes people go through things that change them, Michael continued, his voice gentle. Your mom, she's been dealing with a lot, and I think she got lost along the way. But you didn't deserve any of this, Nate, and I'm going to make sure you're safe from now on. You're going to stay with me. Nate's eyes brightened slightly at the mention of staying with his dad, and Michael felt a surge of determination. He was going to fight for full custody, and he would do everything in his power to keep Nate out of harm's way. His son deserved stability, love, and a safe home, and Michael was determined to provide that for him. Over the next few days, Michael and Nate began to settle into a tentative routine in the hospital. Friends and colleagues from the police force stopped by to check on them, offering support and encouragement. Robin visited frequently, bringing snacks, toys, and books to help cheer Nate up. Her presence was a balm for Michael as well, giving him a brief respite from the weight of his worries. One evening, as the sun was setting outside Nate's hospital room, Michael and Robin sat by Nate's bed, listening to him as he spoke quietly about his favorite books and his dream of becoming an astronaut someday. Michael watched as Nate's eyes lit up, his young face animated with excitement, and he felt a fierce surge of pride. His son was resilient, even after all he had endured. As Nate chattered on, Robin leaned over and whispered to Michael, "He's a tough kid, just like his dad." Michael offered her a small smile, though his eyes remained shadowed. "I wish he didn't have to be tough," he murmured, glancing at his son. "I wish he could just be a kid without all this pain." Robin reached over and squeezed his hand. "You're giving him a second chance, Michael. You're here now, and that's what matters. He knows you love him, and that's going to help him heal more than anything else." Michael nodded, taking comfort in her words. He knew she was right, but the guilt still gnawed at him. He wished he had fought harder in the custody battle, wished he had known what was happening sooner. But he couldn't change the past. All he could do was make sure Nate's future was brighter. As the days passed, Michael filed for emergency custody, a move supported by the evidence of neglect and the severity of the situation. His colleagues rallied around him, helping him navigate the complex legal proceedings and connecting him with resources to support Nate's recovery. It was a long process, but Michael was determined to see it through. One evening, as Michael sat by Nate's side, a social worker named Mrs. Henderson entered the room. She was kind-faced and soft-spoken, with a gentle demeanor that put both Michael and Nate at ease. She explained that she was there to assess Nate's situation and provide support services for his recovery. "Nate," Mrs. Henderson said softly, kneeling beside his bed, "would you mind if I ask you a few questions about what happened? I know it might be hard to talk about, but you're very brave." Nate hesitated, glancing at his father for reassurance. Michael nodded encouragingly, squeezing his son's hand. "It's okay, buddy. You don't have to answer anything you don't want to." Taking a deep breath, Nate nodded and began to speak, his voice trembling as he recounted the dark days he'd spent in that abandoned house. He spoke of the fear, the hunger, the loneliness that had consumed him. Tears pricked at Michael's eyes as he listened, his heart breaking for his son. Each word was a reminder of the trauma Nate had endured, and Michael felt a renewed determination to ensure his son would never experience such pain again. After Nate finished, Mrs. Henderson smiled gently at him. "You're very brave, Nate, and I want you to know that none of this was your fault. You are a wonderful boy, and you deserve to be safe and loved. Your dad is here now, and he's going to take great care of you." Nate managed a small smile, and Michael's heart swelled with gratitude for the woman's kindness. After Mrs. Henderson left, he wrapped his arms around Nate, holding him close. "I'm so proud of you, Nate," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You're the bravest person I know." As the weeks passed, Nate grew stronger, both physically and emotionally. The hospital eventually cleared him for discharge, and Michael brought him home, where he prepared a cozy room filled with toys, books, and soft blankets. He wanted Nate to feel safe, wanted him to know that he was loved and cherished. Settling into their new life together was a challenge, as Nate's emotional wounds were slow to heal. He often had nightmares, waking in the middle of the night crying out for his father. Each time, Michael would rush to his side, holding him close and whispering words of comfort until he fell back asleep. The sleepless nights took their toll on Michael, but he didn't mind. He would do anything for his son. One night, as Michael tucked Nate into bed, Nate looked up at him with wide eyes. "Dad, do you think Mom will ever come back?" The question caught Michael off guard, and he struggled to find an answer. He didn't want to speak ill of Sarah, but he also wanted Nate to understand that she might never be a reliable presence in his life. "I don't know, Nate," he replied softly, brushing a strand of hair from his son's forehead. "But no matter what happens, you'll always have me. And I promise I'll never leave you." Nate nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I love you, Dad." Michael felt a lump form in his throat as he leaned down and pressed a gentle kiss to Nate's forehead. "I love you too, buddy. Always." As he turned off the lights and closed the door, Michael felt a sense of peace settle over him. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but he was ready to face it with his son by his side. Together, they would heal, one day at a time. And no matter what challenges lay ahead, Michael knew he would never let Nate face them alone. Rebuilding trust. Over the next few months, Michael and Nate began to find their rhythm in their new life together. The days were filled with small routines: breakfast together in the morning, school drop-offs, homework sessions, and quiet evenings watching Nate's favorite movies. Slowly, the routines provided a sense of stability that Nate had never really known. And for Michael, being a full-time father meant learning to see life through a new lens. He was no longer just a cop. He was Nate's safe haven, his anchor in a storm-tossed world. Despite the growing sense of normalcy, Michael could see that Nate was still struggling. His son had always been a quiet boy, but the trauma he'd endured left him even more withdrawn. Though Nate would laugh and play at times, there was a shadow that lingered in his eyes, a hint of sadness that didn't fade easily. Sometimes, Nate would stare off into the distance, his gaze unfocused, as though he was reliving the painful memories of being alone and afraid. One rainy evening after they'd finished dinner, Michael decided to bring up the idea of therapy. He had been hesitant, unsure if Nate would be ready, but he knew he needed to try. "Nate," Michael began, sitting down next to him on the couch, "you know how we've been talking about getting better and feeling safe." Nate nodded slowly, looking up at his father with those big blue eyes that held a world of unspoken emotions. "I was thinking, maybe it would help to talk to someone who can help you understand the feelings you're having," Michael said gently. "It's called therapy. You'd get to talk about anything you want, and no one will judge you. It's just a safe place for you to share what's on your mind." Nate looked down, fidgeting with the hem of his shirt. "I don't know, Dad. What if they don't understand?" Michael placed a comforting hand on Nate's shoulder. "I know it might feel strange at first, but there are people who are trained to listen, who understand that sometimes we go through hard things, and they know how to help us feel better about it. You wouldn't have to do it alone. I'd be there to support you every step of the way." Nate was silent for a moment. Then he looked up, a flicker of hope in his eyes. "Will you stay with me?" "Of course," Michael promised. "I'll be with you as much as you need. And if you ever feel like you don't want to talk, that's okay too. We'll take it one step at a time." After a few more moments of contemplation, Nate nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "Okay, I'll try." Michael felt a surge of relief and pride. He knew this was a big step for Nate, and he would be there to support him through it. He scheduled an appointment with a child psychologist named Dr. Linton, who specialized in working with children who had experienced trauma. The first therapy session was a cautious experience. Nate clung tightly to Michael's hand as they entered Dr. Linton's warm and welcoming office, which was filled with soft colors, stuffed animals, and a shelf stacked with toys. Dr. Linton was a kind, patient woman with gentle eyes and a calm presence that immediately put Nate at ease. She spent the first session just talking to Nate, making sure he felt comfortable. As the weeks went by, Nate began to open up. At first, it was small things, talking about his favorite toys, his memories of playing in the backyard, and stories from school. But as he grew more comfortable with Dr. Linton, he began to share more about the darker times, about the loneliness and fear he had felt while locked in that rundown house. Michael would sit in the waiting room during these sessions, his heart aching as he imagined the painful memories Nate was reliving. But he reminded himself that this was a step toward healing, and he was grateful to Dr. Linton for guiding Nate through the difficult process. One day after a session, Dr. Linton invited Michael in to speak with him alone. "Michael," she began gently, "Nate has made remarkable progress. He's beginning to trust again, and that's a big step forward. But I want you to be prepared. Healing isn't always a straight line. There may be setbacks, especially when certain memories resurface." Michael nodded, taking in her words. "I understand. I just want to be there for him, whatever he needs." Dr. Linton smiled. "And you're doing that beautifully. Just remember to take care of yourself, too. Being a single parent in this situation is demanding, and you can't pour from an empty cup. Don't hesitate to lean on others, or even seek support yourself if you need it." Her words stayed with Michael. It was true. He had been so focused on Nate's recovery that he hadn't stopped to consider his own needs. The weight of the past few months, of rediscovering his son under such heartbreaking circumstances, had taken a toll. Yet every time he looked at Nate, he knew he would carry that burden 100 times over if it meant his son could heal. As the weeks turned into months, the changes in Nate became more apparent. He laughed more, his eyes began to sparkle with joy again, and he grew more confident in expressing his thoughts and feelings. One day, while they were watching a movie together, Nate turned to Michael and asked, "Dad, can we invite some friends over? Like Robin, and maybe some of your friends from work?" Michael's heart soared. Nate's request was a sign that he was ready to open his world a little more, to invite others in without fear. Michael arranged a small gathering, inviting Robin, a few close friends, and some families from their neighborhood. He wanted Nate to feel surrounded by people who cared about him, people who would stand by him no matter what. On the day of the gathering, the house was filled with laughter, warmth, and a sense of community. Nate played games with other children, his laughter ringing through the air, while Michael watched with a deep sense of gratitude. Robin caught his eye from across the room, offering a smile of encouragement. She had been an anchor for both him and Nate, her presence steady and unwavering. As the night wore on, Nate pulled Michael aside, his face glowing with excitement. "Dad, I think I'm really happy." Michael knelt down, his eyes filled with pride and love. "I'm so glad to hear that, buddy. You deserve all the happiness in the world." Nate hugged him tightly, and Michael wrapped his arms around his son, feeling the bond between them grow even stronger. They had come so far, through the darkest of times, and now they were finally standing in the light. After everyone had left, Michael and Nate sat on the porch together, watching the stars. Nate leaned his head against his father's shoulder, a content smile on his face. "Dad," Nate whispered, "I don't feel scared anymore." Michael felt tears prick his eyes as he looked down at his son. "That's because you're brave, Nate. And you know what? I'm always going to be here, right by your side." They sat in silence for a while, savoring the peace that had finally found them. In that moment, Michael knew that the journey wasn't over, that there would be more challenges ahead. But he also knew that together, he and Nate could face anything. As he looked up at the stars, he silently thanked whatever higher power had brought Nate back to him, giving them both a second chance. In Nate's strength and resilience, Michael found his own, and he promised himself that he would protect that light in his son's eyes for as long as he lived. For the first time in a long time, Michael felt truly at peace. He had his son back, and they were building a future filled with hope, love, and a sense of purpose that nothing could ever take away. The road to resilience. Months turned into a year, and both Michael and Nate found themselves growing in ways they hadn't anticipated. Michael had learned to balance the demands of his work as a police officer with the responsibilities of being a single parent, and Nate was finding his footing in school, even making a few close friends along the way. The transformation in Nate was remarkable. He had blossomed from a fearful, quiet child into a more confident, curious young boy, and with each day, his smile seemed brighter, his laughter more genuine. One afternoon after school, Nate approached Michael with a piece of paper clutched tightly in his hand. His face was flushed with excitement, but there was also a hint of nervousness. "Dad," he began, hesitating a little, "there's this science fair coming up. My teacher told us about it, and I thought it might be fun to try." Michael beamed, immediately catching on to Nate's enthusiasm. "That's a fantastic idea, buddy. What do you want to do for your project?" Nate's eyes sparkled as he unfolded the paper. "I was thinking about doing a project on volcanoes. You know, like making one that can erupt. I saw it in a book, and I thought it looked really cool." Michael chuckled, nodding in agreement. "That sounds amazing. We'll make the best erupting volcano this school has ever seen." They spent the next few days gathering supplies, researching how to make the most impressive eruption, and creating a detailed model of a volcano out of papier-mâché. Michael helped with the structure, while Nate painted it with earthy colors, adding small trees and rocks around the base to make it look realistic. It was their special project, and Michael savored every moment, knowing how significant it was for Nate to put himself out there in front of others. On the day of the science fair, Nate was a bundle of nerves. He tugged at Michael's sleeve, his face a mix of excitement and worry. What if they don't like it, Dad?" Nate asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Michael knelt beside him, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Listen to me, Nate. You worked hard on this, and you put so much love and effort into it. No matter what anyone thinks, I'm already so proud of you, and I know you're going to do great." Nate took a deep breath, giving a small nod. Michael stood by his side as they set up the project at the school gymnasium, where tables were filled with creative experiments and models. Kids and parents wandered through, admiring the different displays. Nate's volcano, with its realistic detail and elaborate setup, began to attract a crowd, and soon it was his turn to present. With a nervous glance at Michael, Nate took a deep breath and began explaining his project to the audience. His voice was shaky at first, but as he saw Michael's encouraging smile, he grew more confident. He described how volcanoes form, why they erupt, and finally, with dramatic flair, he triggered the baking soda and vinegar mixture to simulate an eruption. The red foam bubbled over, and the crowd gasped, then burst into applause. Nate's face lit up with pride, and Michael's heart swelled as he watched his son bask in the success of his hard work. It was more than just a science fair project. It was a testament to Nate's resilience and his courage to stand in front of others, despite the fears that had once held him back. Later that evening, after they had cleaned up and returned home, Michael tucked Nate into bed. He brushed a hand over Nate's forehead, feeling a surge of gratitude and pride. "You were amazing today, "Nate," Michael said softly, "I'm so proud of you." Nate smiled sleepily, his eyelids heavy. "Thanks, Dad. I felt brave, because you were there." Michael kissed his forehead, fighting back tears. "I'll always be here, buddy. Always." As Nate drifted off to sleep, Michael lingered by his bedside, reflecting on how far they had come. There were moments when he could still feel the weight of the past, the scars that neither he nor Nate could erase. But seeing his son take such a brave step reminded him that healing was possible, even if it came in small, quiet moments like this. A few weeks after the science fair, Michael received a surprising invitation. It was from the police department's Community Outreach Division, inviting him and Nate to speak at a local event dedicated to fostering stronger bonds between law enforcement and the communities they served. The event was meant to showcase stories of resilience and unity, and Michael was honored to be asked. But he was also unsure how Nate would feel about it. At dinner that evening, Michael broached the subject. "Nate, there's an event coming up, and they asked if we'd like to share our story. It's a way to help people understand that even in hard times, we can find strength in each other." Nate looked thoughtful, then asked, "What would I have to do?" "You don't have to do anything you're not comfortable with," Michael assured him. "But if you wanted to, you could talk about how brave you were and how we've been working together as a team. It might help other kids who are going through tough times." Nate was silent for a moment. Then he nodded slowly. "I think I'd like to try. I want people to know that even when things are hard, it doesn't mean they'll always be that way." On the day of the event, Michael and Nate took the stage together. The room was filled with people from all walks of life: families, police officers, community leaders, and children. Michael spoke first, sharing his journey as a father who had struggled to reconnect with his son after years of separation. He talked about the challenges they faced and how he had learned to balance his role as a cop with his role as a dad. When it was Nate's turn, he stepped up to the microphone, his small hands gripping the sides nervously. He glanced at Michael, who nodded encouragingly. "My dad, he saved me," Nate began, his voice soft but steady. "When I was alone, I was really scared, but now I feel safe and I feel happy. I know that sometimes things get bad, but it's okay to ask for help. And I want other kids to know that they're not alone." A hush fell over the room, and several people wiped away tears. Michael's heart ached with pride as he watched his son speak so bravely. It took every ounce of courage Nate had to share his story, and in that moment, Michael knew that his son was far stronger than he could have ever imagined. After the event, people came up to thank them, expressing how inspired they felt by Nate's words. Michael saw how Nate's face glowed with pride, and he knew this experience had given his son a newfound sense of purpose. It was no longer just about healing from his past. It was about using his story to help others find their own strength. As the months passed, Michael noticed that Nate's confidence continued to grow. He was thriving in school, joining clubs, and even making more friends. Their once quiet evenings were now filled with laughter, board games, and shared stories. Nate was not only his son, he was Michael's closest companion, a source of joy and inspiration. One evening, as they sat together watching the sunset, Nate leaned his head on Michael's shoulder and asked, "Dad, do you think I'll be able to help other kids someday, like you help people as a cop?" Michael's heart warmed at the question. "I think you already have, Nate, and I know you'll do amazing things as you grow up. You have so much kindness and strength inside you, and that's something the world needs." Nate smiled, a look of determination in his eyes. "Maybe I'll be a cop like you, or maybe I'll do something that helps kids who feel lost, like I did." Michael nodded, feeling a profound sense of pride. "Whatever you choose, I'll be here to support you, every step of the way." In that moment, Michael realized that they had both come full circle. Their journey wasn't over, but they were no longer defined by the pain of the past. Together, they had built something unbreakable, a bond forged in resilience, love, and unwavering trust. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Michael and Nate sat in comfortable silence, both knowing that the future, whatever it held, would be something they would face side by side, as father and son. A legacy of love and strength. As the years continued to pass, Michael and Nate's journey took on new dimensions, shaping not only their lives, but also the lives of those around them. Nate grew into a young man with a fierce sense of purpose and an unwavering resolve, shaped by the trials of his childhood and the deep love he had come to know in the safe embrace of his father's care. Michael, on his part, had come to understand that fatherhood was the most challenging, yet rewarding, mission of his life, a mission that had changed him profoundly. It was a crisp fall afternoon when Michael received a call from Nate's high school counselor, Mrs. Hampton. Though Nate was now in his senior year, he had always been a quiet, reserved student, and hearing from his counselor was a rare occurrence. "Officer Rodriguez, I wanted to share something special with you," Mrs. Hampton began, her voice brimming with excitement. "Nate has become a true leader in our school. We've seen him mentor younger students, especially those who are going through difficult times. He's applying to colleges with an essay that has moved everyone here to tears. I thought you should know that Nate's work here, his compassion, is remarkable." Michael felt a lump in his throat. Pride swelled within him as he listened to Mrs. Hampton's words, realizing that his son had not only overcome his painful past, but had also turned it into a source of strength and inspiration for others. After the call ended, Michael sat in silence, reflecting on how far they had both come since that day he had found Nate, chained and frightened, in that dark, decaying house. That evening, when Nate returned home from school, Michael greeted him with a hug, holding him close for a moment longer than usual. Nate looked up, a bit embarrassed, but with a knowing smile on his face. "Dad, you're acting weird," he teased, laughing softly. "Is something wrong?" "No," Michael replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Nothing's wrong at all. I just wanted you to know how incredibly proud I am of you." Nate's face softened, and he looked at his father with quiet understanding. "Thanks, Dad. I'm proud of us too." As the months went by, college acceptance letters began to arrive. Each one brought a new wave of excitement and nerves, and together, Michael and Nate celebrated every offer, every scholarship, and every opportunity. Eventually, Nate chose a small liberal arts college known for its strong psychology program, saying that he wanted to study counseling, so he could help children facing difficult circumstances, just like he once had. On the day Nate was set to leave for college, Michael felt a mix of pride and heartbreak. As they loaded Nate's bags into the car, he couldn't help but remember the scared little boy who had come into his life so many years ago. Now that boy was a young man, filled with purpose and compassion, ready to make a difference in the world. They stood on the curb, exchanging a long hug before Nate got into the car. Michael tried to keep his emotions in check, but a few tears escaped, betraying his overwhelming pride and love. "Take care of yourself, Nate," he whispered. "Remember, you're never alone. I'm always just a call away." Nate smiled, wiping his own tears. "I know, Dad. I'll never forget everything you've done for me. You've shown me what it means to be strong, and I promise to carry that with me always." As Nate drove away, Michael stood on the curb, watching until the car disappeared from view. His heart ached, but it was the ache of a parent who had poured everything into raising a child, and now had to let him go to face the world. Michael knew that Nate would make him proud, that he would go on to touch lives and carry forward the legacy of resilience they had built together. Over the next few years, Michael and Nate stayed in close touch, exchanging regular phone calls and texts. Michael eagerly listened to every story about Nate's classes, his friends, and the new experiences that were broadening his son's understanding of the world. During school breaks, Nate would return home, and the two of them would pick up right where they left off, as if no time had passed at all. One winter, when Nate was home for the holidays, he shared a new dream with his father. They were sitting by the fire, sipping hot cocoa, when Nate turned to Michael with a thoughtful expression. "Dad, I've been thinking," he began. "I want to open a center someday, a place where kids who've been through tough times can find support and safety. A place where they know they're not alone, and where they can learn to believe in themselves." Michael's eyes shone with pride as he listened to Nate's vision. "That sounds incredible, Nate. I know you'd make such a difference in their lives." Nate nodded, a look of determination on his face. "You know, it's because of you that I even thought of this. You showed me that it's possible to overcome anything as long as you have someone who believes in you. I want to be that person for someone else." Michael reached over, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "Nate, you already are that person. And I have no doubt that whatever you set out to do, you'll change lives." I couldn't be prouder. Years later, Nate's dream became a reality. After finishing his degree and working in various counseling roles, he finally opened his center, called The Haven. It was a warm, inviting space filled with light and hope, where children and teenagers could come for counseling, mentorship, and a safe environment to express themselves. Michael was there at the grand opening, his heart swelling with pride as he watched his son greet the guests and share his vision for the center. During the ceremony, Nate took the microphone and paused for a moment, scanning the crowd until his eyes found his father's. Smiling, he began to speak. "When I was young, I went through a lot of dark times," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "I was scared, I felt alone, and I didn't know if things would ever get better. But then, one day, my dad walked into my life, and he showed me that there's always hope. He believed in me, even when I didn't believe in myself. And because of him, I'm standing here today." The crowd fell silent, captivated by Nate's words. Michael felt tears welling up, but he let them fall, unashamed. He looked around and saw that many in the audience were wiping their eyes as well, moved by the powerful bond between father and son. "This center is dedicated to all the kids out there who feel lost, who feel like they don't matter," Nate continued, his voice growing stronger. "I want them to know that they're never alone, and that there's always someone who cares. If I can make even one child feel safe and loved, then everything I've been through will be worth it." The audience erupted into applause, and Michael felt his heart swell with pride. He realized that Nate had taken the pain of his past and transformed it into something beautiful, something that would make a lasting impact on countless lives. After the ceremony, Nate walked over to Michael, who pulled him into a tight hug. They didn't need to say anything. The love and gratitude between them said it all. In the years that followed, the Haven grew and thrived, becoming a beacon of hope for the community. Nate's story, and the story of his father's unwavering love, inspired everyone who walked through the doors. Michael, now retired, volunteered at the center, mentoring young boys who needed a father figure. He found fulfillment in knowing that his and Nate's legacy would continue to impact lives long after they were gone. Together, Michael and Nate had built a legacy of love, resilience, and healing, a legacy that would live on in the lives they touched, a testament to the power of a father's love and a son's courage to overcome. And whenever Michael looked at Nate, he knew that the journey they had shared was more than worth it. They had turned a story of pain into one of hope, and in doing so, they had changed the world, one life at a time.